The massive space station hung in the darkness between three suns, its metal halls buzzing with alien chatter and strange smells. Inside Classroom 7, Jake Thompson pushed his chair back slightly and stretched his arms. While every other student in the room wore bulky protective suits or breathed through special masks, Jake sat in just his regular clothes. The air that felt perfectly normal to him was apparently toxic to most of his classmates. Jake had been chosen as Earth's first student in the Galactic Education program, and honestly, it felt pretty weird. The classroom looked like something from a science fiction movie, with floating desks and walls that changed colors. But the strangest part was how all the alien students kept stealing glances at him when they thought he wasn't looking. To his left sat a Velrani student named something that sounded like wind chimes when she said it. Her skin was so clear Jake could actually see her purple blood moving through tiny vessels underneath. She kept her distance, probably because humans were known throughout the galaxy as Deathworlders. To most aliens, Earth was basically a nightmare planet where everything tried to kill you. The insect-like Kithara students made soft clicking sounds when they talked, their forearms constantly moving as they took notes on devices Jake couldn't even begin to understand. Their compound eyes would occasionally fix on him, and he'd catch them whispering to each other in their buzzing language. Then there were the Zephyrians, who looked like walking diamonds. Light bounced off their crystal bodies in rainbow patterns that hurt to look at directly. One of them had asked Jake yesterday if it was true that humans could drink poison for fun. Jake had laughed and explained about alcohol, which apparently made him even more terrifying to them. Professor Veltar stood at the front of the room, her bark-like skin a deep brown and her leaves rustling softly as she moved. She was probably 12 feet tall and looked like a walking tree, but she had the kindest voice Jake had ever heard. Right now she was explaining something about how different species had learned to live together peacefully after centuries of war. The key to galactic harmony, she was saying in her musical tone, is understanding that strength comes in many forms. Some species contribute through technology, others through wisdom, and still others through their unique perspectives on survival and adaptation. Jake knew she was talking about humans when she said that last part. Apparently, growing up on a planet where hurricanes, earthquakes, and wild animals were just Tuesday made humans really good at handling stress. Who knew? The classroom itself was incredible. The walls showed real-time images of space outside the station, and Jake could see cargo ships from dozens of different worlds docking and undocking. Some looked like giant flowers, others like mechanical squids. Earth ships, he'd been told, looked like flying metal boxes in comparison, but they were apparently the most reliable ones in the galaxy. Everything had been going great for the past 3 months. Jake was learning about alien cultures, making friends despite the language barriers, and actually enjoying his classes. The other students had started warming up to him too, once they realized he wasn't going to randomly attack anyone or breathe fire or whatever they thought humans did. That's when everything went wrong. The heavy security doors at the front and back of the classroom suddenly slammed shut with a sound like thunder. The normal white lights flickered and died, replaced by dim orange emergency lighting that cast weird shadows everywhere. Several alien students made frightened noises in their various languages. A section of the ceiling that Jake hadn't even noticed was removable suddenly dropped open. A figure in black military gear dropped through the hole, landing in a crouch that would have made any action movie proud. In their hands was a weapon that hummed with deadly energy, its barrel glowing with contained plasma. The figure stood up slowly, and Jake could see it was some kind of reptilian alien with scales that seemed to absorb light. When they spoke, their voice carried the kind of authority that came from being used to having people obey without question. Everyone stays exactly where they are. The figure commanded in heavily accented Standard Galactic, the language everyone used to communicate across species. Today, this pathetic experiment in integration ends. Today, the galaxy sees what happens when we let primitive savages pollute our centers of learning. The alien students immediately pressed themselves against the walls or tried to hide under their desks. Their evolutionary backgrounds as prey species kicked in, and pure terror took over. Even Professor Veltar's leaves drooped in submission. But Jake didn't move toward the walls. Instead, something very different happened in his mind, something that millions of years of human evolution had hardwired into his brain. Where his classmates saw certain death, Jake saw patterns, possibilities, and opportunities. The moment the armed figure appeared, chaos erupted in the classroom. Every alien student's survival instincts kicked in at once, but not in the way humans might expect. These weren't species that had evolved to fight back when cornered. They were prey animals, and their first response was always to hide. The Velrani student sitting near Jake started shaking so violently that her translucent skin rippled like water. It was something Jake had read about in his species studies, a fear response that made their bodies vibrate at frequencies that confused predators back on their home world. The sound was like a tuning fork mixed with a whisper, and it made Jake's teeth ache just hearing it. The insect-like Kitharus students weren't much better. Their protective shell plates started clicking together rapidly, creating a noise like someone shuffling a deck of cards really fast. Jake had learned that this was basically their version of chattering teeth, except way louder and more annoying. Their forearms wrapped around themselves as they tried to make themselves as small as possible. Even the crystal Zephyrians, who usually seemed so calm and collected, were losing it. Their bodies started flashing different colors rapidly, cycling through what Jake recognized as distress patterns. It was like watching a disco ball having a panic attack. One of them was literally trying to hide behind a desk that was way too small for their tall, angular body. Professor Veltar, who usually stood tall and confident at the front of the classroom, seemed to deflate like a balloon. Her leaves curled inward, and her bark-like skin turned a sickly gray color. She pressed herself against the wall behind her desk, her branches trembling. Even their teacher, someone who commanded respect from dozens of species, was completely terrified. But Jake felt something completely different happening in his body and mind. Where everyone else was panicking, he felt a strange kind of clarity washing over him. It was like someone had suddenly turned up the brightness and contrast on everything around him. His heart rate actually slowed down instead of speeding up, and his breathing became deeper and more controlled. This wasn't the first dangerous situation Jake had been in. Growing up on Earth meant dealing with everything from natural disasters to wild animals. He'd been in a school lockdown when he was 12 after a bear wandered onto campus. He'd helped pull people out of cars after a tornado hit his hometown. Earth didn't give you the luxury of falling apart when things got scary. Jake's eyes automatically started cataloging everything about the intruder. The way he moved suggested military training, but there was something sloppy about his stance that indicated he wasn't active duty. His weapon was held correctly, but his grip was too tight, showing nervousness. Most importantly, he kept glancing toward the maintenance hatch he'd come through, which meant he was already thinking about his escape route. The terrorist was clearly a Nexri, one of the more aggressive species in the galaxy. They looked like walking alligators, but with longer limbs and hands that could actually grip things properly. Their scales were usually green, but this ones were darker, almost black, which probably meant he was from one of their military castes. They were known for being tough and stubborn, but not particularly smart. What struck Jake as interesting was how the gunman seemed to be feeding off the fear in the room. His posture got more confident as he watched the alien students cower. He was puffing up like a bully who just found the perfect victims. The plasma rifle in his hands hummed with deadly energy, but Jake noticed his finger wasn't actually on the trigger. He was trying to scare people, not immediately kill them. That's when those reptilian eyes turned toward Jake's corner of the room, probably expecting to see another terrified student. Instead, the Nexri found himself staring into a pair of human eyes that were watching him with the kind of focused attention a scientist might give an interesting specimen. Jake wasn't cowering. He wasn't shaking. He wasn't even breathing hard. He was just sitting there, slightly turned in his chair, studying the terrorist like he was trying to solve a puzzle. His hands rested calmly on his desk, and his expression was more curious than afraid. The change in the gunman's demeanor was immediate. Jake could actually see the moment when the Nexri realized that something was very wrong with this picture. The confident swagger faltered slightly, and those yellow reptilian eyes narrowed with confusion. "You," the terrorist snarled, pointing his weapon directly at Jake while trying to inject more menace into his voice. "Human, get on your knees now." The whole room seemed to hold its breath. Even the Velrani student stopped her fear trembling for a moment. Everyone expected Jake to either obey or start begging for mercy like characters did in movies. Instead, Jake did something that sent a chill through everyone present, including some of his alien classmates who were starting to remember why humans were called Deathworlders. He tilted his head slightly to one side, like a dog hearing an interesting sound, and asked in the most casual tone imaginable, "Why?" It wasn't defiance. It wasn't bravery. It was simple, Genuine curiosity, delivered in the same tone someone might use to ask about the weather. The complete absence of fear in that single word hit the room like a physical force. The Nexary's weapon wavered slightly in his grip, and Jake caught the subtle shift in body language that meant the predator was suddenly unsure who was hunting whom. Jake stood up from his chair like he had all the time in the world. It wasn't a quick, aggressive movement that might provoke a panic shot. Instead, it was a kind of smooth, controlled motion that spoke of complete confidence. Every muscle worked in perfect coordination, like a dancer or martial artist who knew exactly how the body moved through space. The weird part was how that simple act of standing up seemed to change the entire atmosphere in the room. Suddenly, Jake looked taller than his actual height, and there was something about the way he carried himself that made everyone remember that humans were apex predators from a world that actively tried to kill its inhabitants on a daily basis. "See, this is where you made your biggest mistake," Jake said, taking one careful step forward. His voice was still conversational, like he was explaining a homework problem to a friend. "You did your research on humans, but you only looked at the scary parts. The violent statistics, the war histories, the fact that we turned our entire planet into one big competition for survival." The Nexary's plasma rifle was following Jake's movement, but the barrel was weaving back and forth like the gunman couldn't keep his hand steady. His breathing was coming in short, sharp gasps that the helmet's audio system amplified for everyone to hear. What had started as controlled intimidation was rapidly turning into barely contained panic. "Stay where you are," the terrorist demanded, but his voice had lost all its authority. He sounded like a scared kid trying to convince bigger kids not to pick on him. "I'm warning you, I'll shoot." Jake took another step, and incredibly, the armed terrorist took a step backward to match it. Here was someone holding a weapon that could vaporize a human in seconds, and he was retreating from an unarmed student who was just walking toward him. "But you missed the important part," Jake continued, completely ignoring the threats. "You never asked yourself how a species like ours survived long enough to develop technology. How we went from hiding in caves from saber-toothed tigers to building spaceships that can cross the galaxy." Around the room, the alien students were watching this impossible scene unfold. The Velrani student near Jake's desk had her translucent hands pressed against her mouth in shock. The Kithera were making soft chittering sounds that meant they were trying to process something that didn't fit any of their usual categories. Even the crystal Zephyrians had stopped their frantic color flashing and were just staring. Professor Veltar was standing now too, her leaves rustling with what Jake recognized as amazement rather than fear. She was probably the only one in the room who really understood what was happening from an academic standpoint. This wasn't just a confrontation. It was a masterclass in predator psychology. "The answer," Jake said, taking another step, "is that we learned something every other apex predator missed. We figured out that the most dangerous thing in the universe isn't teeth or claws or venom or even really good weapons." The terrorist's back hit the wall behind him with a solid thunk. He was trapped now, cornered by someone who hadn't laid a finger on him or made a single threatening gesture. His weapon was pointed in Jake's general direction, but his hands were shaking so badly that hitting anything would be pure luck. "What?" the Nexary whispered, and there was genuine curiosity mixed in with his terror. Even in his panic, some part of his brain wanted to understand what was happening to him. Jake's smile got wider, and for the first time, everyone in the room could see his teeth clearly. They weren't particularly big or sharp compared to most predator species, but there was something deeply unsettling about them. Maybe it was because they were the teeth of something that had learned to hunt not through brute force, but through intelligence. "The most dangerous thing in the universe," Jake said, his voice dropping to almost a whisper that somehow carried every corner of the room, "is knowing exactly when to show mercy." The terrorist blinked, confused. "What does that mean?" Jake stopped walking forward, now close enough that he could have reached out and touched the plasma rifle's barrel if he wanted to. "It means that right now, I could take that weapon away from you. I could probably do it in about 3 seconds, and there's not much you could do to stop me. My reflexes are faster than yours, I'm thinking more clearly than you are, and I've spent my whole life dealing with situations where one mistake means death." The Nexary's eyes went wide behind his helmet visor. He was starting to realize that Jake wasn't just talking tough. This was a calm, clinical assessment of the situation from someone who had clearly thought through all the possibilities. "But I'm not going to do that," Jake continued. "Because taking your weapon would mean I'd have to hurt you, and hurting you wouldn't actually solve anything. You're not evil. You're just scared and angry and probably being manipulated by people who convinced you that this was a good idea." The plasma rifle slipped from the terrorist's nerveless fingers and clattered to the floor with a sound that made everyone in the room jump except Jake. The Nexary slumped against the wall, looking like all the fight had gone out of him at once. "Please," he said, and his voice was barely audible through the helmet speakers. "I didn't want to hurt anyone. They said humans were monsters, that you were going to corrupt our young people, turn them violent like your species." Jake nodded like he'd heard this exact argument 100 times before. "And now you know better. That's why you get to walk out of here and go home to whatever family you've got waiting for you. Because the scariest thing about humans isn't that we can be violent. It's that we choose not to be, even when we have every reason to fight back." The next 20 minutes passed in the strangest classroom atmosphere any of the students had ever experienced. After the Nexary terrorist had dropped his weapon, Jake had calmly walked over, picked up the plasma rifle, and begun taking it apart with a kind of casual expertise that suggested he'd handled similar weapons before. His movements were efficient in practice, like someone following a routine they'd done dozens of times. The terrorist himself just sat slumped against the wall, occasionally glancing at Jake with a mixture of confusion and something that might have been gratitude. He'd remove his helmet, revealing a face that looked much younger than his aggressive entrance had suggested. Without the threatening posture and military gear, he looked like what he probably was, a scared kid who'd gotten in way over his head. Jake had carefully placed each component of the dismantled weapon on Professor Veltar's desk, arranging them in neat rows like he was setting up a science experiment. Then he'd simply returned to his seat, pulled out his tablet, and continued taking notes on the lesson that had been interrupted, as if having an armed terrorist break into class was just another minor distraction, like someone's phone going off during a lecture. The alien student spent most of those 20 minutes just staring. The Velrani student kept opening and closing her mouth like she wanted to ask questions but couldn't figure out where to start. The Kithera were making soft clicking sounds that Jake had learned it meant they were trying to process new information that didn't fit their existing understanding of the world. The Zephyrians had stopped their panicked color flashing entirely and were now glowing a steady, curious blue that meant they were in deep thought mode. Even Professor Veltar seemed to be re-evaluating everything she thought she knew about human psychology and conflict resolution. When the security team finally arrived, they came in fast and hard, expecting to find a hostage situation or worse. The lead officer was a Mantaran, one of those big insect-like species that made up most of the galaxy's police forces. They were known for being tough, practical, and not easily surprised by anything. This guy looked like he'd been doing security work for decades, with scars across his chitinous armor and the kind of calm confidence that came from handling every type of crisis imaginable. But even he stopped short when he saw the scene in the classroom. There was a terrorist, sitting peacefully in the corner with his hands visible and his head down. There was a dismantled weapon, arranged like a museum display on the teacher's desk. And there was Jake, quietly working on his tablet like it was just another ordinary day at school. "What exactly happened here?" the security chief asked, his voice carrying the kind of authority that usually made people start talking fast and provide detailed explanations. Jake looked up from his notes with the mild expression of a student who'd been interrupted while studying. "We were having a discussion about conflict resolution methods," he said in the same tone someone might use to describe what they'd had for breakfast. Turned out to be pretty educational for everyone involved. The security team looked around the classroom, clearly expecting someone else to provide a more detailed explanation. But the alien students were still too shocked to speak coherently, and Professor Veltar was watching Jake with a kind of fascination scientists usually reserve for discovering new species. As they led the terrorists away, he kept looking back over his shoulder at Jake, not with anger or revenge in his eyes, but with something closer to wonder. He'd come into this classroom convinced that humans were mindless brutes who solved everything with violence. Instead, he'd encountered something far more unsettling, a predator species that had evolved beyond the need for violence precisely because they were so good at it. After the security team left, Professor Veltar stood quietly at the front of the classroom for several long moments, her leaves rustling as she tried to figure out how to address what had just happened. Finally, she spoke in her gentle, musical voice. "Class, what you witnessed today was a perfect example of why the Galactic Education Consortium was created. she began. Not to teach different species to be the same, but to help us understand how our differences can be strengths instead of sources of conflict. She gestured toward Jake, who was still taking notes and seemed slightly embarrassed by the attention. The human student could have resolved the situation through force. His species is physically capable of violence in ways that most of ours are not. But instead, he chose to use the most powerful weapon in any intelligent species' arsenal, understanding. The Velrani student next to Jake finally worked up the courage to speak. Her voice was barely above a whisper, and her translucent skin was still faintly trembling. But how did you know it would work? How did you know he wouldn't just shoot you anyway? Jake looked up from his tablet and gave her the same friendly smile he'd worn on his first day of class, before any of them knew what to make of the human exchange student. Honestly, I didn't know for sure. But here's the thing about fear. It's usually not about the thing you're actually afraid of. That guy wasn't really scared of humans being violent. He was scared of humans being different, of change, of things he didn't understand. Jake put down his tablet and looked around the classroom, making eye contact with each of his alien classmates. Back on Earth, we have this saying, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. It means that most of the time, being afraid of something is worse than the actual thing you're afraid of. Once you show someone that their fear is based on misunderstanding rather than real danger, the fear usually goes away. The Kithra student who sat behind Jake raised one of her forearms tentatively. But what if you had been wrong? What if he really had been dangerous? Jake shrugged, a very human gesture that his classmates had learned it meant he was being casual about something serious. Then I would have dealt with that too. But giving someone the chance to make the right choice is usually worth the risk. Professor Veltar nodded approvingly. And that, class, is why the galaxy needs programs like this one. Not because we're all the same, but because our differences make us stronger when we understand each other. Class resumed, but nobody was really thinking about the original lesson anymore. They'd learned something far more important about courage, wisdom, and the strange species called humans who had somehow figured out that the ultimate expression of strength was choosing not to use it.